Okay, so these are the lessons that we offer, and they are in what we call 2 suites. And those 2 suites match the league goals. One of the league goals is empowering voters, and that's what the Fighting for the Vote lessons reflect. And one of them is defending democracy, and that's what the Fighting for Change lessons reflect. So we're in the Fighting for the Vote this time. And module 1 is the suffrage timeline, and you see a very brief description. And as I said, under here, you will be able to view the video of this session after we're finished, and then it will be loaded on. Right now, it's the last one. If you want to view the module, you will be able to do that, and I'll show you that. But that's true with every one of these lessons. And the voting simulation. So we're going to go back up to the timeline of suffrage, and I'm going to hit the view module, and it will bring you to the page that has all of the things that you need to be able to present this. Now, just for your information, there are other state modifications here that you can see. The Montana one is there. There's one that Colorado did. And then there's a template. If you were not from New Jersey, you could make it fit your state. There is a Spanish version, and the Spanish version is complete. The slides, the script that a teacher would use, and the cards. Thanks to Dover, New Jersey system, and some students from Drew University who went there to teach in their middle school that they had graduated from. We don't have everything in Spanish yet. That's an ideal. But when you teach the timeline of suffrage, the students or the people in the class are assigned an avatar. And you need to be able to do that in a specific way. So the folder is here. And when you open it up, this is the slideshow so that you have it at your fingertips. But this opens up to slides that are 4 on a page. And what I've done is printed those and then had them laminated because I use them a lot. You don't have to laminate them. You can just print them. It can be on just regular paper. But when you do, you will have all of the avatars that are used in this program. And then you'll need to pick from among the avatars. The distribution of the avatars is important to understand because when we're teaching a group, let's say we have 25 people in a group, and we get to a point in history where certain people are allowed to vote and certain people are not yet enfranchised. We want the visual to reflect what a small percentage of people actually have the right to vote at any particular point in time. So I'm going to give away the first thing. It's not really a spoiler alert, but if there were a class of 25 people, when we get to the Revolutionary War, and only white men 21 years old or older who own property can vote, you'll only see 2 people out of those 25 who can actually vote at that particular time. And it's kind of eye-opening. As you go through history, you'll see. So this distribution of avatars will help you apportion the avatars correctly. And you and I are going to do this now because you're going to have an avatar. So we have how many people here? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All right. We have 7 people here. So if you scroll down, this is the actual percentage in each case. So 10% get the vote first, 15% during the westward movement, 15% when we move up to the Civil War, and then 40% when women get the franchise. So what I've done is to try to make some charts that help you do that. And I've color coded them to make it even easier, I hope. So we are going to assign you some avatars. And when I do this, what I usually do is send this form to the teacher first and ask her to fill in, or him, fill in the names of the students in your class for the correct numbers. And then we give them the avatars. So let's see, right now, Amelia, I'm going to ask you to be George. Tiffany, I'm going to ask you to be Bill. Jean, I'm going to ask you to be Martin. Ray, I'm going to ask you to be Peggy. And Rita, I'm going to ask you to be Jill. Deborah, I'm going to ask you to be Shanna. And Sandra, you to be Ali. Okay. So
I need one.
Oh, name?
Beth.
Who's
Beth?
Done.
No, Beth.
Beth. Okay. Beth.
I don't have one.
Oh, good. Hang on. Let's see here. All right, Beth. And what's the other voice that just said it?
Judy.
Judy. Thank you. All right. All right. Do I have everybody? Okay. So you can see that I use the color coding so that I've got people from each one of the groups. And I didn't worry about whether you were a man or a woman. And I didn't worry about your race. I just assigned you. Because one of the things we do, you'll see, is I say, all right, take just a couple of seconds and think about what it would be like to be that kind of a person. So if you're a man, what would it be like to be a woman? And maybe a Black woman. If you happen to be a woman and you are Black, what would it be like to be an Hispanic woman instead of a Black woman? So it tries to get people to begin to think about what it feels like to be a different person. All right, so now how do you get those? All right, we're going to go back to this. And now I'm going to go back to this. I find this easier to use. So, Amelia, this is you. You're George, you're a white man, 64, you own property. And even though it says citizen, you were not, there was no such thing as citizen, non-citizen at that period of time. So just don't worry about that. But write down for yourself that you're a white man, 64, and you own property. Tiffany, you're Bill. And all right, so you're a white man, 21, and you don't own property. Jean, you're Martin. So you're a Black man, 40, and you own property. Beth, you're Vincent. So you're Black man, 39, and you don't own property. Ray, you're Peggy. So you're white woman, 50, and you don't own property. But now I'm going to say you're a citizen. All right, with the Black men that I just handed out to, it does say citizen. And at that point, there is a designation for citizenship. So the Black men are citizens and Peggy is a citizen as well. Rita, you're Jill. Must have missed Jill. Here. So you're black, 25, you don't own property, and you're a citizen. Judy, you're Kalyan. So you're Cambodian, a woman, 47, and you're a citizen. So you're actually Cambodian American. Deborah, you're Shana. A white woman, 18, and you don't own property, and you're a citizen. And then finally, Sandra, you're Ali. So you're a black boy, 10, you don't own property, and you're a citizen. So I think you can probably see why I find it easier to use the slideshow when I'm assigning people to their avatar, because it's easier to pick up the picture and the name in the slides film strip that's down the left-hand side than it is to use the 8.5 by 11 sheets that you print from.
Why aren't they listed alphabetically to make your life a little easier?
Because they the names wouldn't match the characters, and because there are different periods of time that different
okay.
groups get the right to vote. But that's a good
Okay.
question. I did put numbers on them. Oh, and I do have the numbers here.
Yeah.
On the
Oh, I
charts.
see. Yes.
Okay, so
Okay.
I could have used the numbers. I
Right.
wasn't thinking.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions about the distribution of the avatars? Because now you are that person, and that's who you're going to be for the next 30, 40 minutes. Okay. Oh, let me go back up 1 second. You see that to the left of the slideshow, there is a script. And that's actually what it is. It is a script, and it is word for word what you can use if you present this for the first time. And I say that because the timeline of suffrage is a story. And so you can read it as if it were a story. Don't read it, like blah, 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 blah. Or try to put like you're reading to your grandchild or to a little kid in kindergarten or something like that. Put some pizzazz into it, but it really is a story. And so that you can hear what I'm talking about, that's what I'm going to do today. It is okay to have a book. It is okay. I use a loose leaf binder, and I print on only one side of the paper because I find it easier to read just from the right-hand side, but you can do what's easiest for you, obviously. But this, you'll see, has
Pat,
yes. Did somebody have a question?
Pat, I don't mean to interrupt, but I don't mean to interrupt, but my computer says that it's unstable. So
Okay.
I just want to make sure I get into everything where I'm supposed to be.
Okay, you're probably fine.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Turn off your video and you'll be able to, you probably will have a more stable connection.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Can you turn off your video?
Turn off my video. Sure.
All right, that should improve it. You'll be able to hear everything and you'll be able to watch everything. But I think you'll be able to hear everything.
Okay, that's fine.
Okay. All right, but you can say there are notes to the teacher. There are the actual words you can say. So it is really easy to use. Okay. If you look down the slides, the film strip at the left-hand side, you'll see that I'm going to hide some of the slides because you won't show those during the presentation. Slide 2, for example, is the intellectual property, and all that says is that you've got to respect this. You can't sell it. You can't change it without making it keeping to the policies and so forth. I haven't met anybody who can't follow those, but I'm going to skip it now. You can go back and look at it if you want. If you are with a group that is large enough, you don't have to worry about slide 8. But if you're with a group of people that's only about 5 people, say, this slide will let you give a demonstration of how many people are eligible to vote. And I'm going to show you this. Oh, wrong way. It's going to be the next one. This one would show you how many were eligible to vote out of that class in the beginning. So I'm going to hide those just by doing the skip slide. And then if you are not going to go right on to the next module, which is the truth about turnout, you can use this slide, but tell them they won't be finding this out until the next lesson, or you can hide it the way I've done. And the last thing I've hidden is some resources in addition to what's in here already that you might be interested in taking a look at. So you can do that to make your life simpler rather than having to, jump through them or pass through them quickly as you're presenting. If you find that you need to shorten the show in order to fit into a class period, you can either eliminate some of the information in the script, or you can eliminate some of the slides. Or you can make a break at this slide. And then you can come back another day and try to do the second part. In many places, schools now have a block period scheduling. And so the entire lesson easily fits into a block period. But if the schools still have 40 to 45-minute periods, this particular slideshow won't fit. All of the other ones do, but this one won't because we've added so much information about the struggle that individual groups had even after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were passed. Okay, so are you ready to go? You're going to have this experience. Okay. So I begin each one by telling people that I'm a member of the League of Women Voters. And I make the point that I made before about nonpartisanship and issue agnosticism. I also tell them that the League's been in an organization for over 100 years, and it started because women were fighting for the right to vote, but there are still people fighting for that right. And that's one of the things that the League of Women Voters does. Okay, so the term suffrage, is that a familiar term to you? And in most cases, in middle school and high school, the answer is blank stares. So I thought, oh, all right, what does it look like? What's a word that is suggested by the word suffrage?
Suffer.
Suffer, right. And then I make the point that although many, many people suffered in order to earn suffrage, that suffrage actually means the right to vote. But you can remember it because of the word suffer that's in it. So suffrage means the right to vote. So let's start in New Jersey. And of course, the other states would change this slide or hide this slide. right? In New Jersey, who has the right to vote? And I ask them to suggest them. And then once they're finished, I say, right, okay, so you have to be a citizen, you have to be 18 or older, you have to be, and most of the time they don't necessarily know that it's 18. They'll tell me it's 21. You have to be a resident of the county that you're going to vote in for 30 days. And then they say, but what if I just moved? I say, well, then you go back to the old county and you vote there. And you have to be not in prison on a felony conviction. And I will tell you, I have never had anybody tell me this when we ask for the things that you need to be in order to vote. So I explained that 2 years ago in New Jersey, that the law was changed so that people who have been in prison on a felony but have been released and are returning citizens can now register again. They have to do that. They can't just use their old registration, and they can vote again. And you notice that I said in New Jersey, and that's because that decision is made state by state by state. And that's something you're going to hear again and again in this presentation. There are some states in the United States right now where you can vote when you are in prison. And there are many states where you can never vote again if you have been imprisoned on a felony. But in New Jersey, that was changed, and now you can vote after you've been released and you've returned to society. And that just emphasizes that. Okay, then we talk about building the suffrage timeline. And when I'm in person, I use the cards and I hand them out based on the distribution that we just went through. So that each kid has this thing right in their hands and they can read the criteria for each one of their cards. All right, take a couple of seconds. You know who your avatar is, and just think about what it's like to be the person who is on that card. It may be different from you. It may be a man if you're a woman. It may be a different ethnicity. Just try to imagine what it would feel like to be them. When we play this game and your avatar is eligible to vote, if we were in person, I would ask you to stand up so that everybody in the class can easily see how many people actually have the right to vote. When we do it remotely, I ask people to turn their screens off and on, and I give them that cue when it's the time. So right now, I want to make sure that all of you know how to turn your screen off and on. Is there anybody who needs to know where to go for that?
I do.
I do.
Okay. If you look at your screen down in the lower left-hand corner, there should be a little image of a camera.
Oh,
If
it says stop
click-
video.
Yes, if you click on it, it says stop video. And if you click on it again, you'll start your video again.
Okay.
And my video is up on the top.
Oh, okay. If especially people who have iPads, I'm not looking at an iPad, so I'm not sure where the camera image is, but there
It's on
is
the
a
top
list.
right. Top
Thank
right.
you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so right now I want you to leave your cameras on, and then I'm going to give you directions when you need to turn them off again. All right, so here's the storyline. It's important to recognize that there were people on this land before the original colonies were established. But for our presentation, we're going to begin with the Revolutionary War and the establishment of the United States as a nation. Prior to 1775, we were 13 colonies of England. And the laws to control us were made by the Parliament in England. We couldn't vote. We had no representation in that Parliament. We were powerless to control our own country. So we declared independence from England and started the Revolutionary War. So we know the Revolutionary War was for independence, but I would like you to think about it just a little bit differently. Yes, it was a fight for independence, but it was also a fight for suffrage, fight for the right to make our own decisions about our own nation. So we won the war and we became an independent country, but we paid a really high price. 17,000 Americans died during that Revolutionary War, and many more were wounded or made prisoners of war, and many of those died afterwards. The Revolutionary War is the first example of people dying for the right to vote. Actually dying. So we won the war. Now we had to decide on the rules that would guide our new nation into the future. The 13 colonies became 13 states, each with its own state government. There was no central government to knit the states together. The founding fathers knew that they didn't want a king. After all, they had just gotten rid of King George III, so they had to figure out something new. A constitution was needed to clarify the roles of the central government and the states. So the leaders in this new nation, and take a look at the picture and see what they look like. The leaders of this new nation met and they argued, and I'm talking argued. I mean, they were really angrily arguing, especially about the enslavement of people. So to finally achieve a constitution they could all agree to, they put off solving the issue of slavery. You might be tempted to think that everyone in the new nation would now be able to vote and to have a say in how things would be run, but not yet. When it came to the debate over who could vote, one of the things the founders decided was not to define voting at the federal level. Instead, they gave that responsibility to the states. And that's a theme that you're going to keep returning to again and again. Now, John Adams foreshadowed the voting rights fight. And he foreshadowed how it would unfold in the United States. He spoke passionately about who should have the right to vote. And here's what he said: there will be no end of it. New claims will arise. Women will demand a vote. Lads from 12 to 21 will think their rights not enough attended to, and every man who has not a dime will demand an equal voice with any other in all acts of state. It tends to confound and destroy all distinctions and surrender all ranks to one common level. So, the new nation is established, and they needed to elect a president and a vice president. So in 1788, the first US election was held. Who can vote at this period of time? And this, I ask for you to tell me, what are some of the requirements for voting in that first election?
Male.
Okay,
Own property,
okay,
White,
right?
over 21?
Over 21, right. So male, white, 21 or older, and you have to own property. Right, now, because I want to be able to see this, I'm going to stop sharing. And what I'd like to ask you to do is to shut your screen off if you are not a white man, 21 or older, and own property. And I should shut mine off too.
and how to shut it on.
Lower left-hand corner
Yeah.
is,
Says stop video.
yes, that's what
Oh,
you
okay.
need to do right now.
I guess it did.
Can you get it?
Well, I don't know. Did it stop?
No, I can, there, I can still see you.
Okay, video set. Oh, wait, video settings. Of course, I got all these drop downs.
It should be just a little camera image, like a
Yeah.
little icon.
Yeah, it is, but I keep getting drop downs. Hi,
Okay, we're gonna pretend you're not there then.
thank you, thank you.
Okay, and Amelia, you have the right to vote. George is the one person out of this whole group who's left, who's allowed to make the decisions for all the rest of us,
Wow,
even though we all fought in that war. Every single one of us was involved, and yet only she. And when I'm working in person with kids, I'll say, so imagine it in your own terms. Imagine that she has the right to decide that every other person in this school has to go to school 6 days a week from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. But she can only go 4 days a week. How would you feel about that?
Right,
Or
not
how
good.
would you feel
Mm.
if she made all the decisions about what goes on the cafeteria's menu? And you'll see them like, you know, and then I'll say to Amelia, you've got all this power. How does it feel to you? What would you say?
I'd say it feels pretty good.
Okay, I do too. And sometimes I'll have people going around with their, showing their muscles and that kind of thing. And it just kind of keeps kids engaged and laughing and that sort of thing. All right, so everybody else, keep your screen off right now except for Amelia, because we're going to continue the story and see what happens from here. So I'm going to go back to screen sharing. And you should only see her, so just ignore Sandra.
Yeah, right. Thank you. See,
Okay, so now it is 1856. It's moved ahead about 60 years. We've moved ahead about 60 years, and the westward expansion has occurred. The number of states in the United States has increased. There used to be 13, remember, and now there are 32. The population grew from 4 million in the 1790 census to 23 million in 1850. So big changes. And customs were changing too. People no longer paid quite so much attention to social position because they were more impressed by people who could survive and cope with the difficult conditions that existed when they were moving towards the West. There were also a couple of other wars that had happened in between 1856 and 1788. And there were soldiers who had fought in 2 wars, and they were a little bit upset that they couldn't vote because they didn't own property. They had risked their lives on the battlefield, so why couldn't they vote? But they had to make a change state by state by state. Remember, we separated those powers, and the federal government had no powers over voting rights. All of the states did it. So these men went from one state to another. And finally, in 1856, the last state, which was North Carolina, gave up the property requirement as a condition for voting. So what do we need to cross off now so that we can find out who gets to vote?
Property owner.
Okay. So property owner is clicked off, and I want you to look at your card and or your characteristics. If you were a male, white, and 21 or older, you can turn your screen back on now. Well, hi there, Tiffany. Remember, we still can't see Sandra. All right, so it's the 2 of you. You're the ones. Tiffany, how does it feel to finally have this right? You're muted.
muted.
Fantastic.
Okay, so you can decide what the cafeteria is going to serve now, right? Amelia, let's go back to you. How does it feel to have your power cut in half all of a sudden?
Not as good.
Ah, okay. And at this point in time, we talk about the fight, the pushback that occurs as each new group gets the right to vote. The groups that already have it are literally having their power diminished. And so what are they going to do? They're going to push back. They're going to try to keep things from happening. And that has happened through our entire history. So let's move on. The right to vote was not mentioned in the Constitution, remember. It wasn't until the end of the Civil War that the Constitution itself was amended to set the first nationwide rules about suffrage. And here's what happened. About the same time that the states were eliminating property ownership as a voting requirement, the country was facing the biggest challenge of our history, one that would have a profound effect on suffrage. In the mid-1800s, tensions between the South, which were slaveholder states, and the North, which were called free states, escalated. The northern states wanted any new states that joined the Union to be free states, and the southern states wanted any new states to be slave states. The election of Abraham Lincoln brought tensions to a head. And this is an aside, this is not in the script, but I didn't know this until I saw the Smithsonian exhibit. Abraham Lincoln was not on the ballot in the South. So the South didn't even have a chance to vote for him or against him. And that was one of the reasons why it created the furor that it did when he was elected. He also didn't get all the electoral college votes in order to be president of the United States. So that's a little bit of history that I'm sharing with you that I learned along the way. The election brought tensions to a head, and the South withdrew from the Union and hostilities began. Between 1861 and 1865, America waged the bloodiest war in our history, the Civil War. The war was fought over the enslavement of people and the rights of African Americans. But in the end, it was also about suffrage. In 1865, the North won the war, the Union was saved, the enslavement of people ended, and African American men were given the right to vote. But again, the country paid a huge price in blood for this fight for the right to vote. Between 650,000 and 850,000 Americans died as a result of the war. That's more than in any war we have ever fought.
Wow.
620,000 Americans equaled 2% of the population at that time. Today, that would be the equivalent of 6 million people. Now think about it. We had just over 1.1 million people die from COVID, and we know how difficult that was for our country. In the Civil War, 1 out of every 4 soldiers who went to war did not come home, and many others died because they were prisoners of war or because of their injuries. So for the very first time, this federal government is going to step in. Freeing nearly 4 million formerly enslaved people left some really important questions. One of those was, what rights did the newly freed African Americans have? And were the formerly enslaved people citizens? And if they were citizens, could they vote? So 3 constitutional amendments answered those questions. In 1865, at the end of the Civil War, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution passed, and it ended slavery. In 1868, the 14th Amendment made all people born in the U.S., including the formerly enslaved American citizens. And that is the first time that citizenship is noted in the Constitution. Before that, it was just kind of assumed that white rich men were citizens. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution provides that with a very few discrete exceptions, people born in the United States are citizens of this country, irrespective of their race, their ethnicity, or the national origin of their parents. 2 years later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment changed the suffrage laws across the country, and it gave African American male citizens the right to vote. The 15th Amendment states that, quote, the right of citizens to vote shall not be denied by the United States or by any state, and those are the words that are really important, on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So the 15th Amendment is the first time that the federal government steps in on the question of voting. Who has the authority to decide who votes? And in most cases, the answer is the states. This is the first time that there's a limit put on the states over that authority. Now, we talked about the pushback between these two people who were on screen before. Same thing is true here. So let's go to this. It's 1870. Which one do we need to cross off now in order to see how many people can vote?
White.
White.
So that's off. So look at your avatar. If you're a male citizen 21 or older, regardless of your race or ethnicity, turn your screen back on. Okay. So Sandra, does this fit your character now?
No, it does not.
Okay, then I think we should have one more person on the screen. But we'll let Sandra stand in for that. So right now, out of the 12 to 14 of us, 4 people are making the decision. And that's still a much smaller group than actually is living in this nation at the time. And here again, we've got 2 people had the power before, and now 4 people have the power. So those 2 people just had their power cut in half. How's that going to make it? Not too good. All right, let's go on. All right, and here's one of the places where it's going to get to be fun, and I'm going to have to stop the share for a minute again because I need to maybe it's already done. Oh no. In order to share video when you're working remotely, before you share the screen, you have to click 2 little boxes that pop up when you say you want to share the screen. Those directions are in the notes to the teacher at the beginning of the presentations. So the directions are there and very clear. I think you could step through those yourself. But if you'll notice, down in the lower left-hand corner here, there's a little thing that says Sanjana Bhatta. This is one of our young women who is an ambassador to the program. And she's actually recorded.
It is now 1920. It has been over 130 years since all white male citizens were given the right to vote. It's been more than 50 years since the 15th Amendment gave Black men the right to vote, but women still
Oops, sorry about that.
have no constitutional right to vote. Many women had learned that they could make their voices heard during the struggles to abolish slavery and reduce alcohol consumption. They discovered that they could speak in public and influence political decisions. They decided to try to gain the right for women to vote. They marched, gave speeches, and lobbied politicians. These women were called suffragists because they were fighting for their suffrage. Susan B. Anthony was one of the most famous suffragists. By the early 1900s, a new generation of women took up the fight. They wanted a constitutional amendment to say that states could not deny the citizens the right to vote based on sex. These women suffragists were unstoppable. They marched, they sued, they lobbied, they picketed outside the White House for more than a year through rain, colds, and blizzards. They were harassed, even by other women, many of whom did not want the vote. When President Woodrow Wilson lost his patience with their picketing, they were thinner and weaker. They needed help to walk. Their pictures were in the paper, and President Woodrow Wilson, who refused to support a constitutional amendment for women's suffrage, was worried a suffragist might die. To make sure they didn't die, the starving suffragists were force-fed. They were strapped down, a rubber hose was pushed down their throat to their stomach, and liquid food was poured through the hose. Finally, after all these struggles, President Wilson gave in. He agreed to support the suffrage amendment, and the women were released from jail. The 19th Amendment, guaranteeing the woman the right to vote, was ratified and made into the law of the land in August 1920. However, let's remember that women of color would still have to fight for their vote long after the women's suffrage movement was over.
So Sanjana did the slides that are in this section for women's rights to vote. So if you want to use a youth voice, you can use that, but you don't have to, because the same slides are here. And then you get to the point where you say, okay, it's 1920, who can vote? And which one do we need to cross off now?
Male.
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 Okay,
Male.
so you have two options there. And there are a couple of other places in this slideshow where young people have taken on the role of reading the section that applies to them or their ethnicity. All right, so it's 1920, who can vote? If you're a citizen and 21 years or older, please turn on your screen. Okay, look at what just happened. Isn't that amazing? I mean, half the population actually just got the legal right to vote. And so the number is enormous. You can imagine how difficult it was for men to struggle and give up the enormous power they had by letting these women do it. And so many women felt they didn't have the right because of the cultural norms of that day. They actually didn't want it. But the 19th Amendment was passed and they did get the legal right to vote. However, it's not quite that simple. I'm going to go back to the slideshow. It's pretty complicated. So at this point in time, whoop, that was my warning to say you need to be halfway through. Okay. At this point in time, because people who had the legal right to vote did not necessarily have the ability to vote, I have to ask anyone whose avatar is a Black man or a Black woman to turn their screen back off. I have to ask anyone who is Hispanic to please turn your screen off. If you're Asian, please turn your screen off. If you are Indigenous, please turn your screen off. If you are handicapped in any way, please turn your screen off. And if you're in a classroom, you'll see kids' faces like, I don't think I like this. No, I'm being made to sit down. And what's left is essentially usually about the same number of people eligible to vote to make the decisions that there were at the end of 1856, maybe one more, and that's what we have here. Because now some of the women fit into the category still. But when you looked at 14 people down to 4, it's pretty impactful to the kids that are in that classroom and to the parents and to the adults, teachers and parents. So we're going to go back and talk a little bit more about that. All right. So we talked about progress and pushback, and that fight is still not over. We've seen how state laws and the Constitution itself changed over the course of 2 centuries to remove barriers to voting, to include the poor and the non-landowners, and the Americans and women. But there's much more to the story, because despite the trend towards suffrage, there's been a consistent push in the other direction. As we've seen throughout history, there's been powerful resistance to giving certain groups the right to cast their vote, even when the law has given them this right. So even though we've worked through major milestones, there are setbacks and breakthroughs that we need to talk about. The first setback happened after the Civil War. There were places in the country where people went to extreme lengths to ensure that people of color did not vote. Local and state laws were passed that kept the races separate and did everything possible to prevent Black citizens from voting, and these were called Jim Crow laws. The word Jim Crow means racial segregation and discrimination, and that was enforced by laws and customs and practices. Jim Crow laws removed the political and economic gains made by Black people following the Civil War. They prevented Black citizens from voting and kept Black citizens out of the polls with things like grandfather clauses, literacy tests, property requirements, removing names from voter lists for contrived reasons, poll taxes, preventing ex-convicts from ever voting again, and the threat of violence. Jim Crow laws were enforced all the way up to 1965, and punishment for defying Jim Crow laws was severe. Into the 20th century, men were lynched, were lynched or hanged for trying to vote. So while the suffrage women's movement had its roots in the anti-slavery movement, suffragists later split off, and I'm going to let Amira tell you that story.
While the women's suffrage movement had its roots in the anti-slavery movement, early suffragist leaders later split off from the alliance with abolitionists. They were angry that under the 15th Amendment, Black men would get the vote while white women were still denied. When the 19th Amendment was up for debate, Southern politicians especially seethed over the prospect of enfranchising millions of African American women. The women suffragists faced a moral dilemma. Racist opposition in Congress have led to the defeat of suffrage for any woman. White suffragists turned their backs on the Black women who had also fought long for the right to vote. While technically the 19th Amendment gave Black women the right to vote, whites in the Jim Crow South knew all too well how to keep African American men from voting. Now they were going to keep Black women from the polls as well. 1920 and the passage of the 19th Amendment marked for Black women the start, not the end, of the fight for the right to vote, a fight which lasted until 1965 and the passage of the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts.
All right, and again, that script that Amira read is in the script that you have available to you too. All right, so also included from the franchise were Native Americans, many of whom were not made citizens until 1924 with the signing of the Indian Citizenship Act. Until 1924, Native Americans were required to give up their tribal rights or their tribal identities and moved off reservations in order to be considered U.S. citizens and to have the right to vote. Even though Native Americans had the right to citizenship in 1924 and the right to vote, some states still found ways to keep them from voting. They too weren't guaranteed the right to vote until the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Voting rights activist Gertrude Simmons Bonin, or Sitkalala, of the Yankton Sioux Nation was prominent in the women's suffrage community. She and other Native suffragists didn't only want to have U.S. citizenship. They wanted simultaneously recognition of their citizenship in tribal nations and their treaty rights, particularly to land. They wanted to use suffrage and U.S. citizenship to save their land and their communities. After the 19th Amendment was ratified, Bonin spent the next several years going to white women and saying, "Now you have the vote. Please fight for my people. Don't forget your Indian sisters." Here again, you can take a look at the images because Lily will appear full screen, but you can see the woman on the left is a suffragist who was fighting for the right to vote in 1917. So prior to Americans, the Women's Suffrage Amendment, the 19th Amendment. Mabel Pinghua Lee was also a powerful voice, and that's what Lily's going to tell you about.
Along with African Americans and Native Americans, other groups continued to be excluded from the vote. Asian American immigrants, who were long ineligible for naturalized citizenship on account of race, only won the vote starting in 1943. Among those advocating for both women's suffrage and immigrant rights was a young woman named Mabel Pinghua Lee. She was about 5 when her family managed to immigrate from Canton, China to the United States. She was able to, in the 1900s, through a narrow exemption in the Chinese Exclusion Act. Starting as a teenager, no older than many of you, Lee became a powerful voice in the suffrage movement. People talked about her speeches and how the audience was Mabelized by her ability. White suffragists thought she was amazing, so much so they asked the 16-year-old Lee to march on horseback at the front of a major suffrage parade in New York City in 1912. It would take more than 20 years after the 19th Amendment ratification for Lee and other Chinese American immigrants to become eligible for citizenship and thus win the right to vote. It was not until 1943 and the passage of the Magnuson Act that Chinese immigrants could begin naturalizing as U.S. citizens. Truly broad access to American citizenship and voting rights was not available to Asians and Asian Americans until the Immigration and Nationality Acts of 1952 and the Civil Rights Act of 1965. These acts removed race as a barrier to immigration and
So, we're going to talk about the civil rights movement at this point in time. The 1960s were years of social upheaval that included a national movement to end Jim Crow laws. Civil rights and voting rights champions like Martin Luther King emerged, and under their leadership and inspiration, Blacks and whites marched, demonstrated, held sit-ins, and risked their lives to stand for Black rights. White and Black civil rights voting activists in the South were beaten and arrested, and some were killed. A man was murdered for registering Black voters. 4 young girls were killed when a church they attended, which was a center for voting and civil rights, was bombed, and dozens of activists were shot. But the activists continued to march and demonstrate, and on the Selma to Montgomery March for Voting Rights in 1965, state troopers attacked the marchers with nightsticks, tear gas, and whips. That violence was shown on national television, and it shocked the nation, and it moved the president to act. So we've heard several times about the Voting Rights Act. In 1965, on August 6th, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. And this was a law, not a change to the Constitution. The law gave the federal government the right to review any changes to voting laws in states, southern states, that had a history of voter suppression. And it restored the ability to vote to groups that had long held the legal right to vote but were stopped due to voter suppression. Okay, so it's 1965 now, and what would happen in the classroom is that we ask all of those people who had been made to sit down, or you who had your screen turned off, to turn your screen back on so that you can now vote again. But there was still one more change to the Constitution about suffrage, and that happened in 1971 when the 26th Amendment was added to the Constitution that lowered the voting age from 21 down to 18. We've just seen that the fight for the vote in 2 out of the 3 cases involved war, the Revolution and the Civil War. Well, the 26th Amendment indirectly involved war as well. Here's what happened. Every male in the United States, even today, is required to register with the Selective Service on his 18th birthday. At that time, during the Vietnam War, to get the number of soldiers they needed, the military drafted soldiers from that pool of registered men who had turned 18. The Vietnam War was very unpopular with a large part of the American public, and there were public protests against the war. Many Americans, especially the young, wanted to end our involvement. Of those who died during the war, over half were young men between the age of 18 and 20. Men who had no vote, no say in whether the war should be fought at all. Those new soldiers were old enough to fight, but too young to vote. And the protesters wanted to change that. So the 26th Amendment was passed, and it passed more quickly than any other amendment in history, and 18-year-olds were given the right to vote. So what do we need to cross off now?
21 or older.
Yep, so now it's down to 18. And so now let's have screens back on of everybody now who is eligible to vote. And I think it should be everybody but one person.
Me.
You
But
just
in
wanted to be on
but in
screen
8
the whole
years, I'll
time.
be ready. In 8 years, I'll be eligible.
Okay, good enough. So you would have seen that there would be a very small percentage of the classroom still sitting. So let me go back again and finish up the story. The struggle still continued, however. The 1965 Voting Rights Act, and this is something I never knew, but it gave people who spoke Spanish and lived in Puerto Rico the right to vote in Spanish. But people who lived on the mainland who spoke Spanish were not allowed to vote. Well, they legally were allowed to vote, but they were given a literacy test when they went to the polls. And they were told, if you can read this, then you can vote. And it was in English, and it wasn't necessarily simple. And so most people either didn't even try or tried and then were turned away. So the ability to read and write English, as well as violence and gerrymandering and intimidation, were still being used by states, especially in the Southwest, to deny Latinos the right to vote. And in 1974, the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project was begun. This was the first and largest nonpartisan Latino voter participation organization in the US. And Willie Velasquez was the leader, and there were many other political activists, Mexican-American political activists as well. So then on August 6, 1975, so exactly 10 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed, Gerald Ford amended that act to also end discrimination against so-called language minorities. Protecting the voting rights of Latinos, as well as other non-English speaking groups, made it possible to translate registration materials into other languages and strengthen the political power of communities of color. But there is still one more barriers to voting. Lower turnout among people with disabilities was a result of barriers to the voting box, to the ballot box. Imagine using a wheelchair or walker and not being able to enter your polling place because there was no ramp, or the doors were too narrow, or too hard to open, or the pathway was obstructed and lacked proper signage. Or imagine being blind and encountering a voting machine that did not offer audio or large print ballots. Several federal laws now protect voting access for individuals with disabilities. The 1984 Voting Accessibility for the Elderly and Handicapped mandated accommodations so that voters with personal physical challenges now have a greater ability to vote. And the American with Disabilities Act in 1990 provides a national mandate for eliminating discrimination against individuals with disabilities. Now, you would think that that would have been enough, but another law had to be passed called the Help America Vote Act. And that was in 2002. So in many cases, it's when these young people were actually alive. The Help America Vote Act specifically provided that an accessible voting system must provide individuals with disabilities the same opportunity to vote privately and independently that others enjoy. So you'd think things are looking good, but voter suppression still occurs. Even today, there are things that happen. In some states, people's names are removed from the polls, sometimes for very questionable reasons. Sometimes there are polling places that are closed. There's a story about an 18-year-old young man in the Southwest who lived in a town that was primarily Hispanic, and the Board of Elections decided to close the polling place in the center of town and move it 1 mile outside of town where there was no public transportation to get to it. The young man fought, and the polling place eventually was moved back into the center of town where people could walk and vote. But that's the kind of thing that some people need to deal with even today. The other thing is to sometimes demand difficult ID. Now, students who go to college out of state, Tennessee is a good example. if you go to a university there, you have to really check carefully before you go if you want to vote in Tennessee to make sure that you can meet their requirements, because you need an in-state driver's license and another kind of ID, and then you need to register to vote in Tennessee. And it is, if you just arrived at college, that's a lot to deal with, in addition to getting to adjust to being in college for the first time. There are also places, there was an Indian reservation in North Dakota where the Board of Elections decided they were, or the state decided they were going to change the requirements so that every person had to have a street address who was eligible to vote. And on reservations, there are no street addresses. They use post office boxes. So the tribal elders prior to the election needed to very quickly create street addresses for every single family on the reservation so that they could register with a street address and vote. So that kind of voter suppression still exists. We also had Shelby versus County versus Holder, which eroded Voting Rights Act. Remember I said the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts were laws and not amendments to the Constitution. Well, laws are much easier to change than amendments are. So there was a challenge to it against Eric Holder, who was the Attorney General at that time. And Shelby County argued that there was no longer the need for the federal government to look into states' changes in voting rights because it wasn't happening anymore. The other thing they argued was that it was not fair that only the southern states were being looked at, that they're every state. If you're going to use this, it should be every state. So by a 5-4 vote, the law that helped the government keep people from discriminating against particularly people of color was struck down. And since that time, there have been enormous changes in Voting Rights Act. In some cases, it has made it easier to vote, and in some cases, much more difficult to vote. If you are ever concerned that your rights to vote are being violated, there are 2 numbers here that you can call. And then for when we're working with groups, this is a timeline, and we leave that with the teacher so that if there are questions afterwards. And then this is what we use as our exit ticket. We ask kids to, on a slip of paper that we give to them, to write down something they thought at the beginning of this lesson that has changed in their mind. So I used to think, but now I think. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen, and I'm actually going to give you a second to think about that. And then I'm going to ask you if that happened to you. Did anything change in your mind as a result of this? I used to think, but now I think.
I'll go.
Okay, thank you, Rita.
I used to think that the Civil War was mainly about slavery. But what happened was, but through this, if everyone could vote, then it became a voting rights thing.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else?
I'll go.
Thanks, Amelia.
I used to think that like after the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement, that like made it easier for everyone in America to vote, but in fact that's not really how it worked, and there was a lot of steps we needed to take to get to today.
Thanks. Somebody else?
I think I was surprised about the Native Americans. They were here before us, and they should have been built-in citizens. And the fact that we're still trying to suppress their vote really offends me.
Anybody else?
I'll go.
Okay.
I didn't realize that we had to have specific laws to protect the disabled and handicapped from voting. I figured, well, the ADA probably takes care of that, but there's specific protections. Twice.
Yeah, 3 times actually. Thank you.
I'll go. I taught history for a bunch of years, and it struck me that we went to the peak of allowing different groups, and these days you would think that as much energy is being put into trying to squash the vote with some groups.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, well, thank you very much. When we collect those from students at the end of the day, I usually bring them home and I immediately create myself a sheet and group their reactions into categories. And then I provide that back to the teacher so that the teacher sees that the time that we spent with those kids was really valuable. And particularly when I go into cities or districts where there is a large minority population, that piece where we make people sit down, and then the pieces after that, when they learn how they actually got the vote back, are generally the things that impact them the most. And some of them, may have known a little bit about their history, but like Lily is a very astute young woman and had been really interested in government and so forth. And she said, I didn't even know that. So the kinds of things, it's kind of a wake up call. And so the last thing that I say is, so you'd think everybody would be voting, right? And then the answer, of course, is no, that is not happening. And that's what the next lesson is. Now, I should have said at the beginning, if you need time to take a break for yourself, if you need to get a drink of water or whatever, please do. But because I want to try to fit everything in, I'm going to begin with the next section, and I think you can pick up where you were. This would be the truth about turnout. And we can go back to the website again. All right, so I'm going to go back to the website, and this time we're going to talk about the truth about turnout. So this is a really logical follow-up to what we just did. There is a game at the end of it, and you can see that there are excuses for not voting here. The game directions are here, and there are excuses cards. These are the excuses cards. And again, I don't have this set up as a 8.5 by 11 inch sheet, but I do print these cards again and give them out, and I print them front to back. So this is excuse one, and this answer is the back on the back of that card. All right, but you do have the script again, and then you have the slideshow. And this is one of my favorites, so I don't technically need the script anymore for that, so I'm not going to use it. If we've not done the timeline of suffrage, I start with this slide so that they know that there's been a fight over time and that the fight's not over for suffrage. Some teachers have used, some presenters have used it as a review, like if they did the timeline of suffrage 2 weeks ago and now they're back, they use this as a review. But again, you can pick and choose which slides to use and not use, as long as you essentially keep the story straight. So I hope you have a piece of paper and a pencil or pen handy, because what I'd like you to do now is to write on that piece of paper, so you're committing to this. What is the percentage of people? All right. In the chat, if you'll write down the percentage. Okay. This is what it actually was. It was actually 66.2% who turned out in 2020 So some of
Oh.
you were pretty darn close. But that still means that there was a third of the population who were eligible to vote who didn't. And it wasn't always that good. In 2018, so that was a midterm election, it was only 50%. And in the midterm election in 2022, it was lower as well. So people are not taking advantage, despite how hard it was to get that to vote. Now, elections matter. Why? Well, because there are issues that are important to address in our country. It doesn't matter which side you're on, but we've got to address immigration, things like the environment, guns. This is the slide I was talking about before. Taxes, war, healthcare, education, and there's more. There are many more issues. And the people that we vote for are the people who are going to be making the decisions about those. They're going to be making the laws that will impact how things change in the future. So since we're talking about change into the future, it would be really important, especially important for young people who are going to be living in that future far longer than I am, to be voting, to be making the choices of the people who will make the decisions that they think should be made, not what we can. Now, if I had just done the fighting for the vote, I would skip this because it's the same thing. And then I spend a fair amount of time on this chart. And I spend that much time because charts and graphs can be really misleading if you don't read them carefully. And this is an example of one that can be like that. So there is a title on it, and we're looking at voter turnout rates from 1916 to 1918. And again, this is the voting eligible, not the registered voters. So that's about 100 years. So we're looking at a really long period of time there. If we looked at just this piece of it at the right, we might make some very different decisions than if we look at the whole thing. If we looked at just this piece, we would see a very different picture than what is actually the case over the last 100 years. Something else to notice in this graph is that it doesn't go from 0 to 100. And if you don't pay attention to that, the graph is going to look different to you. So this goes from 30% up to 65%. How might it look different if it was from 0 to 100%? Can you give me an answer? Can you let me know?
Would have been a lot more white space on the top and the bottom.
Okay. Right now, it feels as if there is, a really big difference. And it's way up at the top for the purple line and way down at the bottom for the blue line. And that there's not such there's not a small discrepancy like there is between the two of them, or at least relatively small. The other thing you can notice about this graph is that if you look along the horizontal axis, there are 6-year periods of time in between each one of these. Why might the person who created this graph have used 6-year periods rather than 4-year periods? And think about it. How might that make it look different? But the first question, why might they have used 6 years rather than 4 years?
Because it's presidential and midterm?
That's the most reasonable assumption that I can make. Because they're trying to show, like in 1916, there's a dot right there. And then in 1922, it slides through there. So it's probably that there's a presidential election and a midterm election, a presidential election, and then a midterm election. So but if you're not looking at that, it might change what the information is actually telling you. So when you are working with the graphs in here, you want to make sure that the kids understand that they have to look at them carefully. And there are things they can know for sure by looking at the graph. And there are things that they are making assumptions about. So if you look at this, what is one thing you can know for sure by looking at that graph?
People vote in presidential elections.
More people do, yes.
What people do.
What's something else?
There's like a 20 plus difference between the two,
Okay. Roughly.
roughly.
What else?
Looks
The
like,
graph,
Sorry?
the graph's open to misinterpretation.
It is definitely open to misinterpretation. But what can you know for sure by looking at that particular graph?
It's not a constant, it varies quite a bit.
Right. And do you notice that it almost follows each other? It looks like two mountain ranges that are pretty close in appearance.
Yep.
And
you
what
can
about,
see, you can see from 1964 to 1976, well, 1970, when the Voting Rights Act was enacted, there were more people voting.
Yep. So you made two things there. You're right. There are more people voting in 1964 and in that period of time when the Vietnam War was going on. The assumption part of that is that it is because of those things.
Okay.
So we try to help kids make the distinction between those two things. So look at 2018, which was a midterm election, and look at the percentage of turnout. What is it?
50%.
And it's the highest it has ever been. So that's another thing you can know for sure during those 100 years.
Mhm.
Why might that be the case?
Hard to say, but I would say because Trump was elected in 16, but it was a
Well,
reaction to the previous election.
right. And it would be okay for a student to say that. And you could say that's one assumption you could make. What's another assumption that you might make? Trying to keep the balance in the room. Those are the kinds of things that we want kids to distinguish between. So let's take a look today at who has the power of the vote. We're going to show you a series of graphs, and I'm going to go through them pretty quickly. And I want you to see what I want you to think about yourself and what groups you belong to and see what it says about the voter turnout in your group. So this blue line shows 18 to 24-year-olds. This one shows 25 to 44-year-olds. This one, 45 to 64-year-olds. And this one, 65 to 74-year-olds. All right, so what I'm going to ask you to do is to write down one thing you can know for sure by looking at these four lines and one assumption you might make.
All people vote.
I want you to write it down though, because I don't let the kids talk about it right now. All right, and then we're going to go on. This is the slide that I give them a chance to write on. We're going to go on and look about voter turnout and how it varies by race and ethnicity. Now, all of these graphs that we use have U.S. Census data on it, so it's all verified data. The U.S. Census Bureau has changed the way it names races and ethnicities. The first thing to know is that they do not think of Hispanic as a race. There is a white race, there is a black race, there is an Asian race, and there is there's
Asian Pacific.
There is Asian, but it's not. But in the last census, not 2020, but 2010, there were 6 categories. Now there are 4. So we tried to do our best at making sure that we were consistent in the way we showed the information on the graph. So that's the one place where U.S. Census data might look a little off, but I think it's pretty accurate. So here is the line that shows non-Hispanic whites. This is the turnout there. This one is for non-Hispanic blacks. This one is for Hispanics, no matter their race. And this line is for Asians, which used to include 5 or 6 different categories. Again, make a note for yourself. What do you know for sure? And what's an assumption you can make? Don't tell me out loud, just write it down. Okay. We're also going to take a look at it by education level. This shows voter turnout among people with less than a high school education. And I want you to look at the vertical axis here. Do you notice it doesn't start at 0? So it looks like this is really in the pits, but there should actually be much more white space under it. Now you're at 0 to 100. So now it looks more realistic. This one includes high school, people who have graduated from high school, but not gone on to college. This line is people who have some college all the way up through a college degree, a BA or a BS. And this line includes those people who have some kind of postgraduate degree. So again, write down something that you can know for sure from these lines and one assumption that you might make. All right, so you've got those things written down, and this is what we do with the kids when we're in person. When I do it online and I've got 20 people in a group, I set up breakout groups ahead of time. And I put 4 to 5 kids in each one of the breakout groups. In person, we just create groups right then and there. It's whoever is sitting close to you. All right, and what we want the kids to do at that time is to share with one another first what observations they made. So what's written down on that piece of paper. And it should be things you know for sure and 1 or 2 assumptions. And then when I give the warning for the end of time, one person has to record a statement that they will read to the other groups that they'll share with all of us. So I'm going to stop sharing, and instead, because we don't have that many people, I would like to ask each one of you to share something that you wrote down on your paper that you knew for sure, and something that you, one thing that you assumed.
Seniors are the most committed voters.
Okay. Do you have one assumption that you can make too?
Across all groups, it seemed as though they were more engaged in voting.
As time went on. And that's something you could know for sure. So let's stick with that. What's something else you can know for sure? Or someone else?
The older you get, the more likely you are to vote.
Okay. You're muted, Beth.
Thank you. The more educated you are, the more likely you are to vote.
Okay. Something else?
I think that what I would assume is that we stopped teaching civics a long time ago, and we should bring that back because the younger generation isn't voting, and it may be from lack of knowledge.
Okay, good assumption. One good assumption that you can make based on the data that's there. You don't know that for sure, but it's a good thought. What are some other good assumptions that you could make based on what you saw?
White and Black people seem to have a higher voting rate than everybody else does. And my assumption would be that that's because of the accessibility to vote for different types of people.
Okay.
Also, on one of them, the second slide, Asians and Blacks, the lines were very similar. And I wonder if they feel disenfranchised because of laws that are in this country that, discriminates.
Okay, so you as adults have a pretty good conception of the difference between what you can know for sure and what an assumption is. You'll see kids getting into some interesting, discussions about, well, I don't think you can know that for sure. And so you ask them to show what's in the data. Now, I want to show you something because this is what I'm talking about when I say that there have been big changes. All right, this is the one by race and ethnicity. So you mentioned that these two groups, which were Hispanic of any color, and then Asian, seem to be less engaged. This shows from 2000 up to 2020, which is about the length of time that kids in high school have been alive. So that's why we compress the graph to those years. But if you saw all the way back like 100 years, this is the only bump in that entire line. In every other case, the white voter turnout was larger than the black voter turnout. So that's why I say graphs can be somewhat misleading. And I point that out to the kids. And I say, look, in your lifetime, this is great. This, sometimes it's going to be higher, sometimes it's going to be lower. It should all be higher, but at least in this case, you can see that there are times when black voters have turned out more. Now, look at those years. What assumption can you make about why that happened?
Those are Obama years.
Yeah.
And so I say to them, all right, so let's look at 2016 and 2020. Do you think the results would have been the same if the black turnout had remained above the white turnout? Or do you think we would have had the same results? You're making an assumption, but what do you think? And they'll usually say, oh, I never thought about it that way. So at any rate, that's something that I think it's really important to point out to kids that they do have power. So I'm going to skip ahead now to where we were. Okay, so who's making the decisions? And this is the thing where we bring the whole group together. And essentially what they say is that it turns out that historically, if you're old, if you're white, and if you're well educated, you are the ones that are likely to vote. And if they've been through the timeline of suffrage, you'll ask them, and what was that like? When did we have that happen? And most of the time they'll say, back when at the Revolutionary War or 1856. So that's who has the power today. So voter turnout turns out to be a really big deal. And you young people, if you want politicians to make the decisions that you want them to make for your future, you've got to get involved. You've got to elect people who reflect your values. So is there change ahead? And the answer to that is perhaps. Because look at these numbers. In 2024, there will be 41 million Gen Z people who will be eligible to vote in the 2024 election. 8 million of those will be newly eligible since 2022 midterms. And nearly half of those newly eligible voters are voters of color.
Wow, that's impressive.
And the other thing that I should say that's not on the screen, and I may add it, is that in this election, the percentage of 18 to 24-year-olds that are eligible to vote is 48.5%. That's almost a majority. So if they turned out to vote, they would have a huge impact. And the next presidential election, 2028, they will be the majority. And the majority within that group will be people of color, because whites will no longer be the majority. So they're the ones most likely to influence other people their age to vote. So how can we do that? We need to ask you to help register people to vote. Get your peers out who are eligible. And then we're going to ask you to use some psychology. We're going to give you some of that. And you can remind people that there are no excuses. that you can vote by mail and it will solve many of the problems that people say they have for not being able to vote. And then the last thing you can do is remind people about election day. But let's go back to the psychology. What can you say and why does it work? One of the things that we know influences people's behavior is what the norm is, what's average. We all want to fit in. We all want to do kind of what other people do. So we can say something like, it's really important to me that everybody who is eligible registers and votes. Will you go with me to vote and make your voice heard? The second thing you can do is just slightly shift your language. Because if you say something like, will you vote in this election? You're asking somebody to do it one time. But if you say, you're a voter, aren't you? You're creating the sense that voting is a part of their identity. So if you can remember to make just that little bit of a difference in the wording that you use, it can make a difference. We know from some research that if people make a plan to vote, that they are much more likely to get out to the polls than if they don't. So you can say something like, are you going to vote in mail or by in person or by mail? Or do you have your vote by mail ballot? Or what time are you going to the polls and how are you going to get there? So you help them commit to doing something, just like I made you write down that number before. There's a difference between having it in your head and having it down. And then tell them that you're going to follow up. Because nobody likes to have to say after the fact, oh, no, I just didn't do it. So say something like, I'll text you to find out how it went when you went to vote for the first time. So those are some of the things, making it the norm, calling somebody a thing rather than just having them do something once, helping them make a plan and promising that you'll follow up. Now, what we end with is the game, the excuses game. And each one of the kids is given a card with one of those excuses on the front side and one good answer to that excuse on the other side. And they're given a couple of minutes when they can try to memorize what the answer is to their card, or if they know something that they'd like to add to it, to add to it. And what we say is try to add to it some one of those psychology things that we just talked about. So we give them a minute to do that. And then the game is that the presenter at random picks one person in the classroom. So sometimes I say, whose birthday is close to December 1st? And then out of those people, I pick the person that's closest. So find some don't just point at a kid, but if you can avoid it, try to find some way to pull them out because of their a characteristic of theirs. And that person gets to read the excuse that's on the card they hold, but not the answer. So they read it to everybody, and then they get to choose one of the other people in the classroom to answer that question as best they can. And we make it clear that not everybody knows the answers to these. So what we're trying to do is to learn how to answer it if somebody says this. So the person they've picked on gets to give an excuse and then give the answer. And then the person holding the card supplements that answer. Then the person who was put on the spot gets to read their excuse. Everybody listens, and then they pick one person to answer that excuse and do the same thing for as much time as you have left. Now, if you don't have time and you can just do one or two, that's fine. And I often tell the teachers in the classroom, these are great to use, like, in that 2 minutes at the end of the period when you don't want to go on to the next topic, but the bell hasn't rung yet. Have a set of these in your pocket or in your drawer and pull out one and see if the kids can come up with an answer that's close to what's on the back. And so they're time fillers, but they're valuable time fillers. Now, the next thing is, and I'm just checking my time. Good. I'm going to show you this. We have an ambassador program, and this is one of our young ambassadors and then intern at the time that she made this. We do have an internship for a college student that is 1 semester long. It's a paid position, $15 an hour for 15 weeks, 10 hours a week at the convenience. It is a remote job. So if you know college students who are really interested in civic engagement, please connect them with me so that I can send them the application materials. It's $2,500. I mean, that's a good chunk of change for a kid who's trying to pay their way through college. So I would encourage you to get in touch with them. We give the kids the QR code when we're in the classroom because that links you directly to the application form. So if they want to apply themselves, they can do that. But this is what Jessica says.
My name is Jessica Hoffman. I'm your Energizing Young Voters intern, and I'm here to talk to you about how my journey started at 17 years old and is continuing on at 20 through Energizing Young Voters. I joined the Legal Young Voters in Monmouth County after a presentation in my junior year of high school, just like you guys, and I became a member. I got a lot of cool experiences and opportunities, and one of those was joining Energizing Young Voters and becoming an ambassador. Being an ambassador is so rewarding, and it's so cool to work on issues that you're super passionate about and getting other young people involved in voting. It's a very important topic, and it's really great. Now I'm an intern. I continue to work with Energizing Young Voters, and it's been really cool to progress and be able to continue doing this even while I'm in college. Being an ambassador comes with other perks too, besides being just like the coolest person in the world. You get volunteer hours, you can put it on your resume, you can talk about it during interviews, and it's something that makes you really stand out. And when you show people how passionate you are, people really tend to listen and really like to hear that. So I hope that you consider being an ambassador. Maybe you could be just like me. Thank you. My name is Jessica. My name is Jessica Hoffman.
Oh, come on, Jessica. And the screen that we leave up for the kids has our social accounts. I would encourage you, if you have a Facebook or an Instagram account, to connect yourself with us and follow us, and then share the things that are on that. Our Instagram account especially, there are young people who create those, and one young woman in particular. There are some guidelines because we use the colors that the League of Women Voters uses as their theme colors and stuff, but we're looking for young people who know how to get their peers out to vote, engaged in civic actions and that sort of thing. So take a look at those, follow them, share what we put on, whatever you can do. It's at Energizing Young Voters. All right, and that's it. And we have 15 minutes, so questions and answers are up for grabs.
I have a question, Pat.
Yeah.
My question is, which of these have you used with adults? Because I am looking to run programs at local libraries, and I'm curious which ones have been successful in that particular audience.
The two most successful are the Timeline of Suffrage and the Vote by Design.
Okay.
With adults.
Okay.
Sandra, did you have a question?
I did, because this seems like an enormous amount of information, all good. But I wondered would you allow shadowing at a presentation that you're giving in school? I mean, I think it would be helpful for me to see it live as you're doing it.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
We really encourage people to come and observe first, just so they can see how it works and realize that it's not hard to do.
Okay.
And
Yes.
once you
Sandra?
observe, then we ask if you want to be a co-presenter so that you've got somebody backing you up and they're actually taking the majority of the responsibility. And then you are, by that time, you feel comfortable just taking it off on your own.
Sandra?
Yes.
Sandra, we're working with some of the students from Drew University. And I've been in the classroom a couple of times, so we can talk later.
Okay, yeah, I had planned to call you when this is over.
Okay,
so-
good. Yeah,
Good.
that's why I'm on here. I want to see what
Yeah.
else is happening in this new. And by the way, when I turned off my phone, my service was better. So.
Okay. All right, so yes, and the Drew University people, I mean, they're in central Jersey, so I don't think you would need to be in the greater Morristown area league. I'm sure that they would be more than happy to have other people come in and observe too. And
Well,
the
they're right
kids
around the
do
corner.
an
Yeah,
amazing job.
Sandra and I are in the Sandra and I are in the same
Same
league.
league, and
Okay.
Drew is right around the corner
And
from me.
I've done them with Drew, yeah, and
Yeah.
Rosella too, yeah.
Okay, all right, we'll talk.
Yeah, and Ray, you're close enough that you might want to take a look at them when they do it in Dover. You know, it's
Oh,
Sure.
yeah, we have somebody who can do it in Spanish too.
yeah.
Oh,
Okay,
in
yes.
Spanglish. Sometimes they do
They-
it in both languages. They're amazing.
Bueno.
But I like the library ones. I like the library idea for my own community up here in Butler.
yeah,
Any
we
other
started
questions? Go ahead.
we started distributing some voting materials to all of our local libraries, and I went out last week and brought them something new and put up a poster page that had our meetings and a topic of discussion. And that got me a call from one of the libraries saying, do you do programs? What do you do? And can we set up a date? And it's like, that's a wonderful thing because they help me reach out to people. I don't have to find the people. They're going to help me find the people. So that's why I asked that question. Which of these are most conducive to adults? So maybe I can, start with something pre-canned that I like and go from there.
Yes. And that's really an important point, Jane, because you have to do something that you really like, something that has touched you. And that's also going to make you feel more confident. So just pick one. Pick the one program out of all of the stuff that we have that, that really is important to you personally, and then run with that first. And pretty soon you'll be having them, well, could you do this? And could you do that? And it's fine. Yes, we can. Anything else?
I have a question.
Sure.
I realized that seniors or older adults are the most frequent voters, but does this translate into senior centers and
sometimes I'm going to ask at mine, but sometimes they won't let you into the senior places to do anything about voting because they're and we have to explain to them that we're the league and we're nonpartisan, political but nonpartisan. But I get a lot of pushback from that. But we've gone into the colleges too. Sandra had set up great programs to register high school voters. But that was even before they had they get their registration in the mail with their license.
I think our senior center is fairly welcoming, at least my contacts with them. But does this translate to a senior population? Would this be workable there or no?
So, I belong to my own senior center, and I think one of the things that I might need to be prepared for is some very strong opinions. And it might be really difficult to remain nonpartisan and issue agnostic. So as long as you could make that really clear ahead of time and say, if it becomes a problem, I'll need to stop. I think you might get some better cooperation. They might still argue after you walk out if you need to stop, but at least you're not there doing it.
Well, also, it would seem to me that even though seniors are the more consistent voters, the majority of them probably have children and grandchildren. I mean, I carry applications and vote by mail every time I see my grandkids. So I think it would be a good thing to go to senior centers and particularly that second module where you're showing the difference of what age groups vote. I mean, nothing like having grandma tell you to get to the polls.
Except my grandkids go, yeah, grandma, we know. Yes, we know election day is coming up.
And I think that if you see the different cultural groups maybe there's a generational influence
Right.
that it hasn't been carried down parent to child, grandparent to children, grandchildren through generations. Maybe there's a culture within a family that's more pro-voting and more or less enthused about voting.
Right.
Yeah. Or the culture has kept people from voting because they feel it doesn't make any difference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And if we can start to turn that attitude around, I think we'll be in much better shape. At least much more equitable, the
Sure.
decisions will really be reflective of the whole group rather than just white men. Sometimes I stick in the comment when I'm working with kids, so you wonder why they're all white men in Washington still. And I say, but that's changing, look at a picture now and you'll see a few more women's faces and a few more faces of color, but not a whole lot.
Sure.
What about boys and girls clubs? Have they been tapped at all?
It's really interesting. The woman that does our youth voter registration here in Monmouth County for me, she just went to the boys, what is it? The Boys and Girls Club of Asbury Park.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can't answer that for you, but she has reached out to them. I would encourage you to do that. Any time you can get in front of any group, you're adding to the understanding of voting.
There is a Vote a Girl project that we've done with the Girl Scouts,
Right.
and that's worked out. That's worked out very well.
Yeah.
And that's happening.
Actually,
again
we're
this
doing
year,
it
I
again this
understand.
year.
Yeah. Jean, you're muted.
I came across Voter Girl somewhere and I loved the pictures and I
Oh,
wanted
yeah.
to know more about it. So I'm gonna put my email in here and maybe you can give me a little bit more
Sure.
information.
Yeah, be happy to. Actually, we have a program I think that's coming up in either September, October, yeah, October 19th, I think.
Yeah.
And it's going to be at the Jockey Hollow, is it, Sandy?
I
Sandra?
think, yeah. Yes, Jockey Hollow.
Yeah.
Girl Scout camp.
But
in
I
Mem-
have,
in Mendham.
but I have a lot of photos and whatever from when we did it up at Lake Rickabair, so I can either email some of that to you. I probably have a lot of it on I know I have some of it on my email, so I'll email it to you. Yeah.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Anything else?
I do want to ask one quick question. When you go into the schools, I know we go in with Drew students, but when you go in, do you have to show them your curriculum, your slides and everything to the board before they let you come in?
No, not to the board. I let the teachers know what's in it,
Okay.
but I've never been asked to do that. I
Yeah,
have volunteered it, and maybe I would be asked, but
I'm just wondering but I know that it follows the core curriculum content standards,
Yes.
so I think it would be approved, but I'm not quite sure. I never went to administration.
And that's a really good question, because in the timeline of suffrage, I often am asked, have you ever had pushback because of the emphasis on the different groups whose votes were suppressed, and the fact that voting is still being suppressed and all that kind of stuff. And my answer is no, I never have. And I have done this in very red districts and in very blue districts. So I am pretty comfortable with saying that you're not going to get pushback. But if you did, remember I said it expanded and it got longer because we added all of that other stuff. So from the point where I make people sit down, that's where the program used to end. And then there was a slide about the civil rights movement. And then there was a slide about the current day voter suppression. None of the information in there about Black women or Asians or anything was included. It was still effective. So should somebody say, I'm sorry, but you can't include those things, it's just going to create all kinds of furor in my town, then ask, is it all right if we do it if we stop at this point? And then just add these slides. And a recording from today too.
Okay.
Okay.
We'll
Thank
see
you
you.
so much.
I'll see most of you tomorrow, I think. Thank
Yes.
you.
Yeah.
Have a good day.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So long. Thank you.